Hello, welcome to Intelligence Squared. I'm Timandra Harkness. Our guest today is Liz Pelly. Liz Pelly is a journalist and author living in New York. Her essays and reporting have appeared in The Baffler, where she's a contributing editor, as well as in The Guardian, NPR, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, and lots of other outlets. Today we'll be discussing her new book, Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. Drawing on over 100 interviews with industry insiders, former Spotify employees, and musicians, the book is an exploration of Spotify's origins and influence on music, showing what has changed as music has become increasingly playlisted, personalised, and auto-played. So welcome to Intelligence Squared, Liz.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And I'd say not only did I really enjoy the book, but I found it really interesting because, of course, you can tell me exactly how many millions of other people. I do have a subscription to Spotify. So at some points I found that I was reading the book while listening to music on Spotify as I read, and then thinking, oh, I wonder why this is the thing that I'm hearing now. So the book did slightly change the way that I relate, if you like, to the music that I listen to. So I hope we can dig into that a little bit. But I'd just like to start off because you tell the whole story very comprehensively, and you give some great figures. So streaming accounts for 84% of recorded music revenues, and Spotify has 30% of that market. So yeah, millions of users and millions of paying subscribers. But it only started, I think, in 2008. So maybe you could give us a little potted explanation history of how did it get to be so big so quickly?
hmm Yeah, that's a really good question. So, Spotify was created in 2006 by Daniel Ek and Martin Lawrenson, these two men with backgrounds in advertising. And when they came up with the idea for Spotify, it was an idea for a platform that would give access to a large catalog of media that a user could stream for free. And their original funding model was that it would all be funded by advertisements. At the beginning, it wasn't even really clear to them that it would be a music platform. If you listen to early interviews with early Spotify employees, Martin Lawrenson, the co-founder, they'll talk about how at first maybe they considered that they would do video, maybe it would be music, maybe it'd be audiobooks. As Lawrenson says in these early media appearances, they knew the funding source would be advertising, but they weren't sure what the traffic source would be. And I think that that's really interesting phrasing that I've sort of latched onto, because I think the discussion of music as the traffic source for an advertising product sort of gives you some insight into the thinking in the early days of this product. So the model of any song you could think of funded by advertisements didn't last long with the music business. In the early days, Spotify was originally positioning itself as not necessarily an alternative to piracy, but they described it as something that would be better than piracy, is how the phrasing that they used. But at that time, because of the impact that file sharing had on the music industry, the music business was really averse to anything having to do with free music. They were looking for solutions to what they saw as the problem of free music. So together, sort of in negotiations with the major record labels, the freemium model of having a free tier and a subscription tier sort of emerged. But I do think that even the existence of that free tier at all was part of what made Spotify so successful so quickly. And if you listen to, other people who worked in the music business at the time talking about why this platform was successful where others had failed, because Spotify wasn't the first streaming service. By the time Spotify came along the product launched in Europe in 2008, but they started working on it in 2006. And at that point, Napster existed, for example, from 1999 to 2001. The major labels had been trying for years to figure out how to bounce back from that period. They had tried starting their own streaming services themselves. They weren't very successful. If you talk to people who were in the music industry at the time, they'll talk about how they were really clunky. There was a lot of buffering. The economics of these services was really confusing. There had been other platforms too, like in the US, there was a streaming service called Rhapsody that launched prior to Spotify. There's Pandora, there were other streaming services. People in the music business will talk about how Spotify's user experience was the slickest. They had that free tier. And then eventually in the United States, what I sort of trace in the book is how when they launched in the US in 2011, how their sort of playlist and curation strategy was also kind of part of their growth strategy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the playlists and the importance of playlists and kind of where they came from, because in the book you suggest that the strategy itself developed and changed over a period of time, and it does seem to me it's quite interesting that it's something that obviously Spotify really developed, and it almost seems to bridge a period between actual mixtapes. You're possibly too young to remember this, but I actually am old enough to have had boys make me cassette tapes of music from records that they had. And the idea of the playlist seems to have kind of bridged that to today. You often hear radio programs actually saying, oh, we're, now half an hour of classical mixtape or add to playlist and so on. Could you just maybe briefly through what you see as the key points in that development? I mean, presumably Spotify weren't the first people to say we're going to give you a playlist, were they?
In the book, I kind of set up the concept of the Spotify playlist in two different contexts. The playlist, there's one sort of historical precedent for the playlist, which is just music technologies that allow the reordering of songs. So, I'm thinking about mixtape culture, thinking about other digital music apps that had existed before Spotify that would allow people to have their MP3 collection and create playlists from their MP3 collection. And then there's also, of course, the word playlist comes out of commercial radio. Thinking about the playlists that a radio DJ would have to look towards to fulfill certain like requirements of a programming strategy. So I think it's interesting looking at the kind of, in the book I write about it as kind of, the streaming playlist doesn't really like neatly fit in either of those two lineages, but sort of draws from both of them to create a new commercial curation logic entirely. And there were examples in the kind of like iTunes era of ways in which different like user created mixtapes were commercialized that I also point to as a historic precedent for the concept of the streaming playlist. But for Spotify's purposes, for one, the app launched in 2008 in Europe and then 2011 in the United States. The ability for users to make their own playlists existed from the beginning. But prior to 2012, 2013, playlisting was more of what people from the music business who I interviewed over the years referred to as like a Wild West. They talk about how like the playlisting landscape was really dominated by user generated playlists. And also that kind of, there was this sort of landscape of like playlist influencers who emerged on Spotify in the early days before Spotify had created a strategy to have more control over the user experience. So while I was researching Spotify in order to write this book, something that I spent a long time doing was looking at the front page of Spotify.com on the Internet Archive and looking at the different ways in which Spotify's homepage changed over the years. And I noticed that there was this one really particular moment in 2012 where the way in which Spotify seemed to be positioning itself and its product offering really changed really quickly. For the first few years of Spotify's existence, its branding, the way it was sort of putting forth its offering as a product was more about giving users access to all the music in the world. It would talk about Spotify as a way in which to access a world of music. It was really focused on prioritizing words like instant, simple, free, and kind of explaining what streaming was. And then there was this moment in 2012, around December 2012, going into 2013, where the front page really changed. And all of a sudden, it was like this early Instagram aesthetic filter imagery of people in their cars, sun flares, walking along the side of the road on vacation, a person in a hammock. And it was more about like, painting this Spotify as this lifestyle product, or sort of kind of trying to signal to potential Spotify subscribers different moments in their life in which maybe they would use Spotify to soundtrack a moment or a mood. And this was right before they launched this new brand campaign called Music for Every Moment. And it was also the year before they hired an in-house team of playlist editors to start curating playlists largely themed towards certain moods and activities. So there clearly was this moment where they really shifted thinking about what they were offering, from it being about accessing all the music in the world to the product being about recommending you the perfect song for the perfect moment when you open the app. And according to some of the research I did, there's actually, a research study that Spotify had commissioned on its own user base, where they were able to kind of recognize that more users were coming to the platform than they realized for recommendations for more of a Pandora-like lean-back experience. And it seems that after that research was conducted, they started to sort of optimize for that type of user.
I actually looked at Spotify first when I was writing about personalization, because my last book is all about why is everything personalized now. It's how is through technology, but I was interested in why. And I looked at Spotify a little bit, and I thought at the time, well, for me, this is actually a really good example of personalization, because I do get control. And if I particularly want to listen to something, so I went and I went, oh yeah, I like Fela Kuti, so play me Fela Kuti, and then it recommended me other things that were like that, and I could choose, and then also I could get things that obviously other people have made playlists. So for me, I was thinking this is a really interesting example of the mixture. Obviously, there's an algorithm there somewhere picking up on what I've listened to before and feeding me things. I gathered that there were humans curating it, as you say. There were humans deciding what goes on a playlist and what gets accepted. And then, of course, there was the choice by me. And I actually wrote, well, for me, this works really well, but I could see obviously for the musicians, it doesn't work that well, but we'll come back to that. So, but reading your book, all of that is a lot more complicated than that. But I was really struck by the personalizing, as you say, the turn towards saying, this isn't about we have the music and you come to us. It's about we will feed you the music that fits your mood at that particular time of day. And something really struck me actually was you mentioned, well, in fact, you quote somebody called Tia Denora talking about a technology of the self. And then the Spotify Nigeria ad that says your music, your world, playlists made just for you. And that seemed to really fit that moment of everything has to be personalized. But at the same time, I did think, is that not just a trend that has been happening since the Walkman came out in the 1980s? And suddenly, instead of having to listen to music from outside of yourself, you could have your own personal soundtrack and go around. It's like, no one else can hear this, but this is my personal soundtrack. So what was it that Spotify did that really took that to a new direction or a new level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that I tried to illustrate in the book too is that I write in the introduction that the story of streaming is as much about what's changed as it is about what's stayed the same. And I think that that's an important distinction too, because in the early days, streaming was really pitched as this new disruptive technology, like other platform companies of the late 2000s and 2010s. And I think it is interesting to look at some of these aspects of the platform that were pitched as sort of, these things that were going to be democratizing or game changing, that really were like a continuation of pre-existing histories and practices and dynamics. So even in these moments where what streaming is doing is replicating pre-existing habits or practices, I think it's also sort of instructive. Yeah, I think that the reason why I point to someone like the academic researcher Tia Genora talking about this long history of music being used as a technology of itself is to sort of, show that the ways in which people use music to soundtrack a moment in their lives, and how sort of this is kind of part of how we sort of like construct our sense of self, or how we like think about how we exist in the world. This obviously is not something that streaming created for the first time. And I do agree, like, yeah, what you said, there's maybe has more to do with like the evolution of music technology over the past 30 or 40 years. I think that when I think about the way in which streaming personalization has really made an impact, I mean, one, it's like the sheer amount of data that is collected on users in order to make this whole algorithmic recommendation system possible, that I think in the streaming era, there's this real tendency to say, like every year on Spotify Wrapped, oh yeah, like, the system collects all this data on me, but it's just music. So like, isn't that interesting? But, in order to have a more sort of robust understanding of how data markets exist and what actually happens when platforms collect all this data on us. As one of the lawyers I interview in the book points out, the data is never staying with the platform, especially when you have a company like Spotify that's so much part of this sort of landscape of data brokers and marketing companies and advertising and data sharing and partnerships with different corporations and things like that. And then I also think that when I think about the sort of consequences of streaming era personalization, like, yes, there's the whole like conversation of data collection, surveillance, and privacy. But then also just the way in which I think it has really contributed to this overarching dynamic of passivity, that has become so sort of such a defining dimension of streaming era music recommendation. I do think there are some aspects to the way in which algorithmic music discovery started in the streaming era that are sort of interesting. Like in the early days of Spotify, their music recommendations were largely based on this pretty straight ahead concept of collaborative filtering. Like, this person likes music pretty similar to what you like, so we're going to show you stuff from their catalog that you've never heard of before. On its own, that's, I think simple enough and like kind of interesting way to get music recommendations. Something that I try to chart is the way in which personalization and algorithmic recommendations on Spotify sort of changed over the years. I think something I commonly feel like I hear from people is, I used to learn about all sorts of stuff on Spotify, and these days they just show me a list of stuff that I listened to already, and kind of like charting.
Yes, that sounds familiar. Yes.
The reliance on the listening history. And one moment that I really noticed was in the trajectory of personalized recommendation on Spotify. There was this moment where the language really shifted from discover and being about discovery and showing you stuff that you hadn't heard yet, to now, if you open Spotify, the language you're more likely to immediately see is made for you, and kind of more focused on, showing you things that you already have kind of signaled that you like. Kind of oftentimes it's like this pool of music that is based on your listening history that is being sort of repackaged and sold to you through different themed boxes. So, trying to unpack a little bit about how those changes came about and the different points in the history of the playlist system where influential things happened that changed the direction of the strategy is interesting.
You've mentioned it a couple of times, the lean back idea of listening, and again, as I was reading about that, and I had music on in the background because that's what I do. I find it easy to concentrate if I have music while I work. I thought, oh, that's exactly what I'm doing. I am having music in the background without really listening to it, and deliberately, in fact, choosing music that won't distract me too much. And so I thought, oh, I'm doing exactly what you're talking about, lean back. But then I also thought, I don't always do that with Spotify. There's often I will just have the radio on. If the radio is playing classical music, that doesn't distract me. So again, I thought, in what sense is this new with Spotify? Because there is a long history of people just having the radio on in the background while they do stuff. What is different when Spotify does it with their selected, personalized feed of music?
Mm. No, that's a really good question too. And I also should say that I love to have the classical radio station on in the background in my house and the jazz radio station. I feel very lucky to live in New York City where there are really amazing community FM radio shows. And in some ways, yeah, so like chapter 3 of the book, it's called Selling Lean Back Listening, and it's about the rise in the streaming era of what the music business refers to as the lean back listener. So someone who is content to, hit play on a playlist themed to a mood or activity rather than actively searching for a certain artist or album. And it's absolutely true that streaming services did not create this idea of the lean back listener, but and also that the history of commercial radio or radio in general could be understood as a sort of history of lean back listening as well. But I think that's something that you'll hear a lot from people in the music industry is the ways in which streaming services really championed this way of relating to music, not just lean back listening, but what the industry refers to as functional music. So music for studying, music for reading, music for sleeping, music for meditating. And there, something that I try to unpack in the book is the different consequences that this has had on music and culture. I think something that is particularly interesting is, in the book, I talk about this phenomenon of the ghost artist, or this practice that became popular around 2016, 2017 on Spotify, where they started to populate some of their popular lean back playlists, functional music playlists, especially playlists filled with instrumental music, with this kind of stop music made by artists that seemed to not even really exist. And this became a popular conversation in the music business trade press and on social media, people saying, I was listening to this study playlist and I pulled up the different artists' names that appear on this playlist. And it seems that, these artists have generative AI images on their profiles and there's no bio, and I can't find any information on these artists anywhere on the internet other than on Spotify. Like, it seems like these artists aren't real. And that had kind of been speculated about for years. There had been some investigative journalism on it in the Swedish tech press. But I was able to really lift the veil on this story in my book and learn that it's actually this internal practice at Spotify. They refer to this content as perfect fit content, and their internal description for it is music commissioned for specific moods and playlists with improved margins. And for the most part, this music is coming from specific production companies that then commission artists to, crank out 12, 15 tracks an hour released under one-off monikers, or, just monikers they have for specifically these tracks. And they're, paid a different type of royalty rate in order to produce this material. So
So they are real humans making the music, but they're producing it like by the yard to order, rather than this is my creative process that's producing music.
Yeah. In the reporting that I did on it, that's what I found. It's interesting because there clearly is sort of like this big question that it raises. If people are only half listening to this music and it's really meant for like a background listening experience, and already you have anonymous producers making it in bulk, like it seems obvious that there is some sort of path for this practice to just also be kind of taken over by generative AI music production. And is that something that is going to happen? I think in a lot of ways, one of the biggest issues I see with this practice is that people are being recommended this music and it is nowhere on the platform made clear that they're being recommended certain tracks due to certain commercial deals that exist, that this music is being made by stock music companies or like, what I refer to as ghost artists. It's not labeled. And it really raises similar issues that the conversation around generative AI music already is raising too, is that, I'll have people, since this article came out, sending me links being like, can you tell me if this is a real artist or not? Do you know if this is generative AI? And I feel like those aren't questions that anyone should ever have, especially not about music that's being recommended to them under the umbrella of an editorial recommendation. I feel like it should be labeled if it is music from generative AI, if it's music that you're being recommended due to some sort of pre-existing commercial partnership. This is stuff that should be clear to the listener.
That they're playing it because it's cheaper for them and not because it's something that I would want to listen to necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.